On today's video, we're going to be spending some time in Fairlanes and Pigtown, two of the largest mobile home parks in Bradenton, Florida, to understand why mobile home parks make for the best land grabs in Florida. Now, just in the last year and a half, they've had like 5 or 6 homicides between these two mobile home parks and their vicinity, as well as other deaths that are definitely suspicious. But despite the homicidal violence, there's one great thing about these two mobile home parks is that you don't have to pay lot rent. You actually own the land, but you do have to pay an HOA fee. So there is some type of structure over these mobile homes. Now, many people believe that as long as they own the land, they're good to go. But in the case of these mobile home parks, they're still part of an HOA. Now, Bradenton, Florida has more mobile home parks than anywhere in Florida. Many of them are owned by one single entity. However, there are parks like these where each individual lot has a particular owner. In the case of this park right here, you can see that the mobile home park has started to buy the lots from the owner. So eventually, they do want to own the entire place. But they practice many strategies in order to convince these people to sell the land, like raising the lot rent. In some of these mobile home parks, the lot rent has got just as ridiculous as renting an apartment itself. So even if you own the land inside of a mobile home park that's part of an HOA, you are still susceptible to land grab tactics. Basically, a developer wanting to swallow up the whole entire mobile home park. In the 50s and 60s, land was available and affordable in Florida. You practically couldn't give it away. These mobile home parks were large because land was affordable and mobile homes went up fairly quickly. However, these mobile home parks that were once in the middle of nowhere in what was then the outskirts of cities today are big messes of absolute destruction in the heart of urban cores. These mobile home parks may have initially been far out in the outskirts and undesirable land, but today these outdated mobile home parks are sitting in the heart of urban cores. Take Bradenton, for example. Much of the center of the city is nothing more than these old mobile home parks that have been here for decades. Meanwhile, the suburban sprawl spreads far inland now. So problem A, land becomes valuable. These mobile home parks are giant pieces of land. Everything around these mobile home parks is fragmented, but to be able to obtain a large piece of land, one single unit, one single parcel that is just completely available is difficult to find in Florida, with the exception of mobile home parks. And mobile home parks are very easy to demolish. There's no concrete here. There's no rebar. These are practically trailers. So when it comes time to redevelop and rezone these parcels, it's very easy for cities to allow them to knock down the entire park and easily build something new. Many people assume that simply because they own the land that they don't have to worry about a land grab, but that isn't exactly true. After all, a lot of these mobile home parks are part of an HOA, and that in itself could provide the opportunity for a developer to want to get their hands on the entire area. Now, in the case of Fairlane Acres and Pigtown, the mobile home parks we're in right now, each individual parcel is owned by the owner, but they are still part of the HOA. This is a vulnerability that a developer could exploit in the future for a land grab. Now, if they were not part of an HOA, these do exist, where it's just a city or county parcel of land, most of the time that is a safer investment because it is not part of an HOA and it is not part of a mobile home park. It's just a piece of land you own like any other. This is the Pines Mobile Home Park on Bradenton Beach. 2 blocks from the beach, it's much more attractive real estate. And while these mobile homes have been here since the 50s and 60s, they do not own the land. They are paying lot rent. They may have a title for the mobile home, but they do not own the land. This particular piece of land, the person who owns it currently is doing a land grab to remove the people from their homes and to redevelop or rezone these properties. Now, normally the city building department doesn't allow rezoning. People in Florida want affordable housing. So the notion of getting rid of a mobile home park to rezone it as something else would suggest that the person in the middle of this process must have some type of connection or assurance that he will be able to rezone this area, something that in theory shouldn't be guaranteed in the state of Florida. But one just never knows, really. Now, the people who bought these mobile homes technically couldn't have even bought it from a realtor because realtors are only allowed to sell land, and well, this is not land. It isn't a real house. It's a trailer. Now, there are realtors that will sell you a mobile home where you don't own the land, but in theory, according to the laws of Florida, they shouldn't be doing that. Most people who bought these mobile homes would have bought it from a for sale by owner because after all, realtors technically, the way that real estate laws are set up in the state of Florida, shouldn't be selling these types of properties. My wife is a realtor or was a realtor here in this metropolitan area. She had a customer that wanted to buy a particular mobile home that was not a piece of land, an individual parcel. It was inside a park, and my wife wasn't able to do the transaction. The broker said, "This is not a piece of real estate. We cannot sell you this." But despite the fact that these types of properties are not exactly considered real and actual real estate that a realtor could technically sell you, many people will pay real estate prices for mobile homes on lots that they do not own under the perception that these mobile home parks have existed for decades and well, they're still here somehow. Usually the real estate value of these types of mobile homes where you pay lot rent would only really reflect the structural value of the mobile home, which many times isn't much. But unfortunately, because that piece of land that you're renting is adjacent to the water within 2 blocks of the beach, many people paid artificially inflated values for mobile homes on land they didn't own, and now they're finding out that they have legally practically no rights to this land. Under the presumption that these places have been here for decades and they've existed this long, many people believe that that will continue to be the case. But as real estate prices appreciate, these people are finding that they really don't have any legal rights to this land. On top of that, the existing laws about lands and mobile homes haven't been modified in decades, meaning that they're outdated. The amounts of money that these people have to pay people to relocate their mobile homes are so unrealistic to the cost of living today because these are outdated laws, and well, it hasn't been touched in so long, hasn't been updated. The state of Florida hasn't cared to protect the rights of people living in these places. And to be fair, from the perspective of cities and state, it doesn't make sense to propagate the idea of people living in trailers, particularly on an island. These are somewhat outdated eyesores that were not meant to be inhabited for this long. Many of the older mobile homes cannot even fall under building codes because they were existing before the Florida Building Code. And that's made able to protect the interests of people who live in these properties because one of the tactics that developers are using is trying to get these mobile homes condemned. The older ones cannot be condemned because they do not fall under the Florida Building Code. Despite the fact that the laws are already heavily in favor of the people that own the land, not the people that live inside the mobile homes, these builders and developers even go further on to corrupt local officials and ensure that a already one-sided deal becomes even more unfair to the people getting evicted. From a legal contract perspective and from rights of ownership perspective, it's already a one-sided deal favoring the people making the evictions happen. But despite that, they go even further to corrupt local officials to ensure changes of zoning, which are not always guaranteed. They shouldn't be guaranteed. Now, some of these communities do have a planned urban development plan. These are plans that look into the future of what they want their cities to be moving forward. However, that doesn't exactly grant access to property owners to be able to have a fast track to evict people, knowing that these zoning changes are automatically approved, because technically they're not until you submit the plans, until you submit the permits for the new buildings. What grants these individuals the freedom to go ahead and fight these legal battles and evict these people? Probably corruption, knowing that the officials that are in place can easily be convinced to make these zoning development changes happen, when in theory, in the state of Florida, that shouldn't be an easily or light taken decision. I think most people in Florida at this point would agree that rezoning land to another land use that is more unaffordable isn't what people in the state of Florida want, but developers are able to corrupt local officials to ensure that. And that is why, despite legally being entitled to being able to evict these individuals, it's the practices that they implement and the corruption that they engage in to ensure these land grabs that makes them a land grab. It isn't that they don't have the right to evict these people from their land. It's the fact that there's corruption on many levels to ensure that they can rezone the land into another type of land use that isn't exactly what the people of the community want. In theory, there should be no assumption from the community's approval that a land use change will actually take place, but there must be something that convinces these developers to go ahead with these massive operations as if they already knew the outcome of these decisions. After all, different types of development, like these apartments right here, yield much more profit. In fact, in the case of a development like this, where it is 5 stories at $2,200 a month, which is what a new apartment would rent for, times 12 months a year, on the same land of one single mobile home that yields $12,000 in lot rent, they can make as much as $132,000, which means that it would be reasonable that even if the person who lives on that land were only to receive the fair market value of what the structure would sell for on the real estate market regardless, these types of investments would pay off in the first year. So we're not talking like they're making this a 5 or 7 year stretch to recover their money simply for paying people what is due for losing their homes. In the case of Bradenton Beach, they are only paying people $1,600. Yes, $1,600. Now, assuming that they only go with a 5-story structure that was of the same population density, you're talking about $280,000, being that directly on the beach they would rent for at least twice as much, if not more. These people are going to be making, once the building is finished, $280,000 a year on the same land that they are now charging roughly, I believe, $1,200 a month. So let's get this understood. Right now, they're making $15,000 or $20,000 a year off of these mobile homes. They can make that be worth as much as 10 times more. In the case of the land grabs in Miami, they're going as high as 15 stories. So if you do the math, it would be reasonable to pay these people $40,000, $60,000, $80,000 in order for them to give up the rights to their mobile homes. Interestingly enough, in the case of Bradenton Beach, the homeowners are telling me that they're only getting about $1,600. Considering that once they are out of there, in the first year, they're looking to make easily $250,000 on the same piece of land in the first year of after development. It should give you a pretty clear indication that these are some pretty scumbag developers who are forcing people off the land and paying them practically nothing. Amounts of monies that were written on paper back in the 1970s when things, metropolitan areas, cost of living, were nothing like what they are today. By kicking people off of these mobile home parks and creating high-density apartments, they can go from making $10,000 per unit of land to making $200,000 per unit of land. You would assume if they stand to make such large profits by rezoning this land, that they would at least do these people the simple deed of paying them $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 for these mobile homes. In the case of Sweetwater, Florida, where the new buildings that are being built are about 15 stories high, they are offering $14,000. In the case of Bradenton Beach, it's only $1,600. And this is why these are considered land grabs, because it isn't the fact that they're evicting somebody from the land that they don't own. It's the shady business practices and the way that they handle these business transactions with lack of ethics, dealing with individuals that could even end up being homeless, being that what the books allowed for them to get paid back in the 1970s when these laws were written have nothing to do with the cost of living today. Mobile home parks are definitely the most vulnerable place to live in Florida right now. And even if you own the land, there are still weaknesses that a potential developer could exploit in a potential land grab. In fact, I would say that even condominiums that are part of HOAs are currently being targeted, and the avenue is lawyers that start litigation within these communities. Two entities will buy property in the same place and start endless litigation that drains the funds of the HOA and eventually leads to assessments, which forces people to sell their homes because they can't afford them. These are the Florida land grabs that are literally leaving people homeless right now. Homelessness is already rampant here in these cities in Florida, like Bradenton and Miami, and it's crazy to think that these municipalities would actually allow developers to take actions that will potentially leave hundreds of people vulnerable to homelessness in their communities. Many people would say that the incentive for many of these cities to allow these land grabs to take place is that the newer developments would make a higher tax base. And while that may seem logical, it's really the amount of cash money that these developers offer to corrupt these politicians that really makes the difference in ensuring that these changes take place. If you are in one of these communities in Florida where you are paying lot rent, there are many tactics that can be implemented to start a land grab. It would first start with jacking up your lot rent. Eventually, you would start to also have many code violations, as the people that are trying to ensure the land grab will start doing things like claiming right-of-way ownership or fees, or finding anything they can to start to fine and make your property end up being at odds with current regulations. In Naples, Florida, there's a street that has mobile homes that was recently hitting people, just about everybody in this community, with a right-of-way violation. Now here, there's no HOA and the people actually own the land. But despite that, there appears to be some type of land grab happening in this area, and they've recently started hitting people in this mobile home community with right-of-way violations. This is a completely absurd type of violation that will cost the homeowners thousands of dollars to replace driveways that existed before the current building code and that are actually on a county maintained easement, not even on their own properties. But wait a minute, how do you know that that particularly would indicate a land grab? Well, it's pretty straightforward. See, back in 2011, the Road and Maintenance Department actually worked tremendously on the street, and that would have actually been the time for them to have noticed that the area where they were working on had all these violations. Now, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the county is persistent that dozens of right-of-way violations be repaired, even though these people really don't have any business doing with a county easement. So why is the county all of a sudden so persistent on a right-of-way violation when they were there in 2010 and 2011 and didn't say anything about it when they paved the road and completely redid the entire drainage for the street? Now, in this same time period, from 2011 to 2019, you had individual properties on this street who had overflowing septic tanks, and the county continued to back-to-back obey these complaints. That means to throw them out, not consider them. So here you have rental properties with overflowing septic tanks for nearly 10 years. People were complaining about people's septic tanks overflowing, and code enforcement did absolutely nothing about it. They looked the other way, and despite the many complaints, they kept abating the situation. Now, all of a sudden, everybody on the street, just about, or half the properties, get hit with right-of-way violations, which could in theory lead to these properties becoming foreclosed because not everybody on the street is able to afford out of nowhere to rip out their driveways, put in new culverts for an easement that doesn't even belong to them. In the past, when this county has fought individuals about obligations to the easement, they've had to back down because it was outside of their jurisdiction. In the past, this particular county of Collier has been finding and redefining regulations and violations against mobile homes that were exempt because they were pre-building code, despite the fact that these violations were not really in their jurisdiction because these mobile homes were built before the building code. They were exempt. The county still went ahead and charged people fines for violations despite the fact it was outside of their jurisdiction. So now, all of the sudden, we're going to be persistent about a right-of-way violation in this community despite the fact you've been letting overflowing septic tanks go unchecked for nearly a decade. If you live in a mobile home in Florida, it is plain and simple. You are under threat of a land grab by a developer in conjunction with corruption with county officials who on one side let everything slide unchecked until one of their buddies needs a favor, and then they get persistent about things. Once they turn the tides on you and want to demolish your mobile home park and evict you, the residents many times have very little option to defend themselves legally, since after all, many times they're already working with corruption. Any loophole that hasn't been met legally can easily be corrupted in the position to leave you evicted. In theory, if there's a protected species like a gopher tortoise that lives on your property, they're not allowed to rezone and rebuild anything on the property because they're protected species. However, if somebody has the ability to predict what zoning department will do in the future, they probably also have the ability to make sure whoever does that inspection doesn't see those protected species. That's really one of the few things that can save a mobile home park, is something like a protected species living there. But again, if they're able to predict what zoning is going to do in the future and go ahead with these massive evictions as if they knew that they were going to be granted a land rezoning before permits are applied for, what chance do you really think you have against these corrupt developers and officials? Unfortunately, affordable housing in Florida is being stripped away. The vast majority of these mobile home parks are 55 and older. These are people who moved to Florida for an affordable retirement, and greedy developers have snatched it away from them, many times leaving these people homeless. Today, many people entering homelessness in Florida are elderly people who are having whatever they worked for their whole life stripped from right underneath them. Buying a mobile home in a community where you do not own the land means that you do not own the land. And if you think there's any type of legal protection that's going to stop a developer from leaving you homeless, you must be living underneath a rock, because this is happening to people throughout the entirety of the state of Florida. Many times there are little legal catches that would prevent these developers from being able to do that. But if they're working with corruption, nothing will stop them. In the state of Florida, insurance companies have also been robbing these people blind, requiring amounts of insurance that are unrealistic and barely paying, if paying at all, when properties are destroyed. But when they finish one type of criminal activity to steal from these elderly people in Florida, the state of Florida is just now starting to enact laws regarding insurance after they've already blindly robbed many people. Before one scam is over, they start the next. And it seems like the next phase of exploiting Floridians, as the homeowner insurance scam comes to an end, the next phase is taking away homes from people who are many times elderly, in parks that are for 55 and older. The idea of 55 and older parks is the notion that the state would have some type of protection and flexibility for affordability for those who are most vulnerable, like people in advanced age. These are the same people that are being victimized by developers right now in the state of Florida. Before you buy in Florida, learn about what you're buying and make sure that you don't end up in a situation where your entire investment ends up getting hauled away on the back of a dumpster. This is a sad reality of land grabs in the state of Florida and the embarrassing schemes of the wealthy to get even wealthier at the cost of those who are the most vulnerable in society, people in 55 and older parks. Embarrassing. Welcome to Florida. And remember that it's the same people who told you to move to Florida a few years ago who are now ignoring your emails for help when a developer is trying to evict you and leave you homeless. While you're at home typing emails to every person you can think of asking for help, chances are that those people are playing golf with the same developers who are leaving you homeless. All of a sudden now the state of Florida is finally going to do something about the cost of homeowners insurance, because there's nothing left to steal from people at this point. But as they quote-unquote fix one problem, the next problem is already underway and running rampantly nobody to listen to the cries of help from the elderly who are losing everything they have to the greed of developers, a state that victimizes and allows the weakest people in society to be guinea pigs for these developers' greedy plans. An absolute embarrassment, but this is the way the state of Florida works. There's been a YouTuber who's been warning you all along, but nobody listens to him. I'm sure there's a few other YouTubers that talk about real estate that are more popular than me these days. I guess my knowledge of how the state of Florida works isn't as sensational as a New Yorker who just became a realtor in Florida.